Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. We're going to get off and running with some stats from Veeam's 2024 Ransomware Trends Report that really caught my eye. The first, according to the report, is that cyber victims reported that they were unable to restore 43% of whatever data was affected by the ransomware attack. This reaffirms what a number of security breach guests have stated about trusting hackers after paying their extortion demands. The second finding shows that 63% of ransomware attack victims restored the compromised systems directly back into their production environment without some type of quarantine or scanning method. The risk here, obviously, is simply bringing the ransomware right back to where you removed it. This is a big contributor to these ongoing frustrations we see that are associated with dwelling or living off the land attacks. As much as we'd like it to, ransomware is the story that simply won't go away. Some of this stems from a hacking community that continues to draw from a growing treasure chest of financial and technical resources. The other is that we continue to fall short in executing some of the basic blocking and tackling of cybersecurity, like protecting logins, improving visibility of our OT environment, and securing key devices. Here to discuss these topics is John Terrill. He's the Chief Information Security Officer of Phosphorus, a leading provider of security management services and solutions. John, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. So we're going to dig into ransomware. We've talked about that a ton. It's continuing to be this huge plague for the industrial sector. But I know with Phosphorus, you guys take a little bit different focus in looking at more at the device level and talking about device ransomware. Could you maybe just kind of spell that out for us a little bit in terms of how you assess that at the device level?
Yeah, so I don't know that we necessarily address the ransomware component, but more about how ransomware infects those devices. And I don't know that when we're talking about the kind of OT and IoT world that we're normally talking about traditional ransomware. And the reason for that is that these devices, and for better or worse, these devices are not really intended to have additional software added to them. So we're not trying to install things. A lot of times we're actually seeing the inherent and the functionality of what the device was designed to do be leveraged for like ransomware. So think changing passwords, putting in corrupt firmware, the kind of thing that can kind of turn that device into a brick, or it could be something that you have to kind of ransomware back. That's not as much of a problem if you're talking about a Chromecast for like a consumer. You throw it out and you go get a new one. But if you're talking about $100 million of infusion pumps or gas meters or robotic arms for a manufacturing plant, that's a very different kind of like proposition.
Absolutely. So we continue to talk about these issues in all of those different areas and those different assets that you just mentioned there. In your experience, why maybe has the industrial sector and manufacturing been a little bit slower to insulate itself against some of these attacks?
So there's a couple of reasons for it. And I think part of it is the industrial sector, the OT folks, whether that's pharma or like manufacturing, like whatever that is, your IT side kind of got told hands off. We've got our OT specific specialists. We're going to segment those networks entirely off. These are not traditional IT, even though they've got computers in them. So they kind of got told we're special and don't touch it, just give us network connectivity. The other side of it is from the attacker side, which is a lot of their playbooks are about reproducible and kind of replicating working patterns. So if you've got a toolkit, why come up with a custom thing for these devices if you don't really understand the consequence of taking them over? Which is why I think we're seeing more and more of this. Because people are starting to realize that these things are actually important. And in many cases, they're core to what their business is. But a lot of whether it's directed or kind of opportunistic, the ransomware so far has been just taking a known pattern of let's get a foothold inside of a company and then use kind of tactical tools to go after their Active Directory and trying to find ways to pivot and live off the land. And then you'll find some way to disperse kind of known ransomware.
It's really interesting because we continue to hear about the growing complexity of these ransomware organizations, how they're getting more specialized, they have more resources, and
Yeah.
really they're taking a lot of the same traditional approaches in getting into these networks, getting into the OT environment. It's once they get inside that things have become more complex and more difficult to detect and respond to. Is that accurate? Is that kind of what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I mean the growth in the devices, the growth in complexity, the fact that these kind of segmented OT networks that you're like, oh yeah, no, that's a whole different thing you can't get to. These networks are effectively flat, and that's kind of the dirty little secret that most people don't don't really want to talk about is the fact that your corporate network and your OT or broadcast or industrial, like whatever that side is, oftentimes is a lot more porous than like people think, and within it it's very flat. So once attackers can get in, they've got a lot of stuff to poke around on.
Yeah. You bring up a couple of interesting points there. I want to go back a little bit to something you were saying before about that whole sort of how we've defined the different responsibilities between the IT folks and the OT folks, and they're kind of siloed and not working together. What have you seen recently? We're hearing that these two sides, we're trying to get them more in the same room and talking to each other, but it continues to be a challenge. I guess, what are you seeing there? And has there been some sort of approach that maybe has helped getting those two sides working together more?
So I think the more information that's making it out there, especially from groups like CISA, are getting people on the OT side to go like, okay, maybe we should be open to getting some help. Like maybe this is a thing that could be a problem. Um, I I think it's for, and I'll kind of separate the world into two buckets. One is the industries that I'll kind of call like device forward. So think the manufacturing, the oil and gas, folks where the devices for everybody in the company, they know that's core to their business. It's what generates the revenue. It's what delivers the product. The other bucket, and I think this is probably a less focused on group, which is everybody that we kind of think of as kind of the white collar, the office workers. So think financial services, tech, legal, media. Those folks that we sent them home during a pandemic, and you're like, well, if we don't need the office, the devices inside of it must not matter. And you're like, well, that's actually not the case, because once we go back, your general counsel still has a printer, your CEO still has a phone on his desk, your board, still has teleconferencing equipment. There's door controllers, there's cameras, like there's a lot of that stuff that I think is not thought of in the kind of OT world. But if you take out the HVAC system for a building, in most places, you can't work in that building anymore. We talk about ransomware computers, but if you take over the elevator controller for a building, you can start ransomware people. I think that's just a different thing that we've not seen a lot of, but we're seeing more and more of it.
Absolutely. A couple things to dig in there. First of all, when we talk about, and you mentioned the people element of ransomware and of cybersecurity, it's becoming more and more prominent. It's becoming a bigger part of the conversation. As we bring on more devices and we have more people using them, where do you think the focal point needs to be? Is it on securing those devices when we bring them in, or training the people to understand their role in cybersecurity with all this new technology?
So I don't know the right answer to that. And I think it kind of goes back to the question that you had brought up around like the OT side of the network and like the folks that are focused on those devices. A lot of times when we're thinking about these things, the people that are bringing them in are not the IT group. The IT folks are the ones tasked with the security, but it can be folks that are specialized in pharmaceutical production that happen to own the devices, all the way to facilities and a janitorial staff. Like those are not the people that you're really going to say, hey, we need to make them security experts. And trying to do this at scale to try to enroll these things if they don't have a secured default is genuinely like a difficult task, especially when you're seeing numbers like 3 to 5 times the number of devices as what you have for people.
Yeah, it's
So
probably on the low end. Yeah, it's crazy.
That's roughly what we see for non-specialized folks. So
Okay.
think think the office worker, that kind of like second bucket. That's
Hmm.
roughly the number. When you start looking at the kind of like the oil and gas world, where you've got smart meters and things like that, that number can be like a factor of like 25.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's interesting too, and we've been kind of bouncing around here talking about some of the different factors. The hacker is the biggest part of this component, and it feels like in some instances, going back to even Colonial Pipeline, where they're using credentials
Sure.
basically to get in there, it feels like in some of these cases, they're sort of establishing a blueprint that others can copy and use for hitting other industrial entities and organizations. What are you seeing there in terms of the hackers seem to be learning a lot more quickly than we are in terms of best practices?
Well, I think it was Rob Joyce who ran the, the offensive side of the National Security Agency. He gave a talk a number of years ago, which was essentially the attackers are trying to understand your network and understand the devices within it, what the scope of that looks like, what the identities look like. I think that's the start of that. I think the reason that they're getting a lot better at this is their tools are really designed to come in and they don't mind breaking things. And I think on the defender side, we've got a lot of folks that they recognize they don't know what's there. Their asset management's not right. Maybe they don't understand the flows, what's supposed to talk, and they can't answer a lot of basic questions at times. But they're also hindered by the ability to roll stuff out fast and to figure those things out. There's a lot more caution that they're going to break the network before the attacker does. So I think there's some cultural problems there that they're not necessarily empowered to be able to go in and identify that stuff. And then it's a really easily kind of a replicatable model, right? We get in, we use a bunch of these tactical tools, crack map, exec, and empire, and all of this stuff that's kind of been bundled up for folks, and it works really well. It's really good at rapidly being pervasive and infecting the rest of the network. So I think from a ransomware perspective, like it's such an easy model now that folks are like it doesn't take a lot of skill. In fact, I think from an automation standpoint, I'm kind of surprised we've not seen more kind of leveraging kind of AI and other processes to make that a thing that kind of a one-click take over the company. I've kind of speculated for years that like you would think you'd see more of this with kind of these kind of loud, almost like kind of cyber weapons that they just come in and rapidly take over. And I think part of the reason we've not is the attackers don't have to. The tactical kind of one-off is still so easy. They come in, they get a foothold, they use Mimikatz and some other stuff. They find a way to pivot, and then they can disseminate these binaries, and it just kind of works.
Do you think the segmentation strategies that have been implemented have prevented that somewhere, or is it just a choice by the hackers?
So, putting on a different hat, in a previous life, I had co-founded a microsegmentation startup. And I have always been a big believer in trying to be able to segment aggressively, but it's hard. It's a difficult thing. A lot of the products don't work well, and I think the focus is in the wrong areas. And when I think about like the IoT world and the OT world, I kind of think back to where I think a lot of the assumptions around this come from, and that uh, having been in financial services prior, I was kind of thinking like, what is our IoT strategy, and are we concerned about this? And I think it really goes back to the New York Times hack from like 2014, 2015. So the Chinese essentially were trying to go after dissidents for like the Dalai Lama and Tibet, and it was generally it was harder for them to go after the people directly. So they tried to go after the New York Times journalists. So they broke into the New York Times to see if they could figure out how to snoop on those journalists. And the New York Times had a pretty good team, and they were able to get them out, but they kept getting reinfected and reinfected. And they're like, where are these guys coming from? We can't figure this out. And it turned out that for 6 months, they were living on an IP-enabled thermostat. And that kind of shifted the understanding of, oh, we have these things on our network. We need to protect ourselves from the IoT, from the OT. Let's segment them off, and then they can't come back into the rest of the network. But I think over time, we're realizing that we're protecting ourselves from these devices and not protecting the devices themselves. And that's kind of the conclusion that we're getting to now is, oh, the devices matter. These OT things are core to our business. These other devices are special and kind of cross the cyber physical boundary that allows us to have an impact in the real world. So I think that's part of it. To go back to the original question, I think segmentation is essential, but a lot of people are barely keeping the network up. So asking them to have dynamic strategies for user policies and being able to kind of have hard cuts between certain areas, whether they're physical or logical, a lot of times it's just not practical. So you've got to find some alternative options.
Interesting. That's well said on a number of fronts in terms of defining the device as what we're trying to defend, as opposed to the vulnerabilities it opens up. Well said.
Right.
And it's interesting. You talked a lot about what the hackers have learned and how they're constantly probing and different inroads they can take to infiltrating networks and everything else. What have we learned on the good side? What are the good guys learning from these attacks, or what are some of the biggest improvements maybe you've seen in the last couple of years? To me, the last 36 months on the industrial side for cybersecurity has been huge, leaps and bounds in terms of the levels of improvement. But what are you seeing?
I mean, I will credit CISA. I think they have been able to show to shine a light on a lot of the attacks that are going on within that industry. Whether that's utilities, municipalities, that I think that's been kind of the big wake up call. I think we're also starting to see politicians start to talk about this. I was just talking to someone yesterday about the Routers Act that I guess had just passed the House. I don't know how much that was well informed and how much of that is kind of, are we trying to ban Chinese devices and making that a geopolitical thing? But I think folks are starting to wake up to the fact that these things are a real problem. I think the secure by design concepts from like CISA are a great first step. But I think one of the problems there is we're not seeing a lot of the stakeholders for the device manufacturers showing up. It's the security industry, it's big tech, it's folks that are very well-meaning. I think have made a meaningful improvement to security for a lot of consumer devices. But I don't think we've found that it's made its way into those industrial ones yet.
So what do you think is the reason for that? Is it just a lack of collaboration between all the stakeholders? I mean, the users of that equipment need to play a role as well. The cloud security providers need to play a role. The suppliers need to play a role. Are we just not getting together closely enough to talk about security, or who's falling down there, I guess?
At times it feels almost too big because it requires so many stakeholders. I think there are components of this that are addressable within pockets, but it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all type of thing. I think some of it's the device manufacturer. A lot of those device manufacturers, though, are white labeling stuff. So you've got the same devices just getting repacked in different boxes. The software gets tweaked a little. It gets a logo swapped out. I think a lot of that's a problem, too, and that we've gotten used to cheap devices, and we're generally happy about them. Like, is a vulnerability a problem? Not if it's not going to get exploited. And if it does, what are they going to do with it? If they can watch a camera, does that matter? Well, if that camera is pointed at a Bloomberg terminal, it might. If that camera is watching a city park, it might not matter that much. So I don't know that there's any one fix to this. I think there are a lot of basic things that can be done around more secure defaults, around the ability to automatically update devices, not having, default passwords that you can instantly Google. Just even the basics of like using a serial number from the box is better than starting off with an admin type of thing. So there's a lot of basics. I think also um, the software security world, if you look at Microsoft and Apple and Google and all the work that's been done around DEP and ASLR and all these things that made really meaningful improvements to make exploitation a lot more difficult. That stuff's not baked into most of that OT IoT world. I think like HP and some of the printer companies are really the only ones who have done anything with it. And that's just from some outside pressure from exploits from 15 years ago. But like it's not made its way in when they're running BusyBox and they've got 8 megs of RAM, and that's the entire thing. So it's definitely a different, like it's a different thing, and I think we've really underestimated what these things can do from a software level and how that translates to the hardware and the physical world.
Well, I think especially when we look at manufacturing, where uptime is the key, when we look at implementing these new technologies, we need to get up and running as quickly as possible because we still got production goals to hit and everything else. Talk about updates. We've discussed patching before and what a challenge that can be, just because you're taking stuff offline to put that patch in or upgrade that software or whatever the case might be. It's an interesting dynamic, and I still think the manufacturers in particular still rely a little bit too heavily on the suppliers or even some of their network partners, especially when you look at the cloud, to provide sort of that organic security. And it's not probably at the level that it should be, or things just get misconnected or not connected properly. And in the meantime, there's a security vulnerability.
I mean, they're still not thinking that these things are computers, right? They're thinking that these are part of a manufacturing facility, and it's like it was 30 or 40 years ago, and there's a person that's there. I don't think that they're thinking about it in the, if you could take over the brain for this device, what could you do with it? Like there doesn't seem to be that kind of like creative kind of maliciousness.
The troubleshooting, yeah.
The why would anyone want to do that question? Yeah. But I think, and just to give an alternative to the manufacturing side, stopping production is one thing. I think that's happening. What if you just stop part of the production or tweak it just enough where it's now a defective piece? A recall is a lot more expensive than pausing the production. So that, and I don't think we're necessarily talking about these things in the right light. For instance, when we discuss these devices, a lot of times we're talking about vulnerabilities and CVs and exploitability scores and all these flaws. And you hand somebody a list of, here are your problems. And they go, great, we believe you. Those are probably real, and we should probably address them. Whether the team you're handing it to is able to or not, that doesn't really convey the reality of this. If it's, hey, here are problems, and that shuts down production, your board is going to hear that and go, oh, that's problematic. This is not a pedantic list of problems that we're supposed to address over time. When I think about like the water infrastructure for like a city, we were talking with a customer, and they were like, oh yeah, we've got all these PLCs, and we're like, hey, we've got default passwords on them, we've got all this stuff that we found, and there's a bunch of things that we can do to help fix that. And they're like, yeah, that's great. We don't really know what those PLCs do. I'm like, oh, well, do you know what part of the network it's on? They're like, yeah, it's in the water filtration part of our network. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So after doing some digging, we're like, so if we turn these off or change the state of them, you'll stop filtering the wastewater and poison 80,000 people. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that sounds bad. It's not that we had default passwords. It's that you can poison a town. And I think that's like, we're not talking about the actual impact of what these devices do if they're tampered with, right? It's not that I've got, a vulnerability because you've got a 6-year-old firmware on an HVAC system. It's that I can turn it off and, force everybody to work from home for 2.5 years because those chillers take 3 years to build.
Yeah. No, we've talked about those PLCs before in relation to the Unitronics hack that happened over in Iran and how that ended up impacting could have impacted more municipalities and businesses here in the U.S. before it was uncovered.
Sure.
Shifting gears a little bit here, John, let's talk about
Yeah.
Phosphorus a little bit. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the company, what you guys are up to.
Okay. So the company started in 2017, and our founders had gotten together, and I guess there was a paper from the University of Wisconsin-Madison where the general finding was that most of these kind of IoT, OT devices had 6 or 7 year old firmware and weren't really part of a regular IT patch cycle. They all had default passwords for the most part. And the only real defense for the market, and this has been kind of the edict for the last 25 years, is that passive collection is the only option, right? We can put stuff on a span or a tap. You can get net flow. You can function more kind of like an IPS, but that's the only game in town because you can't change the software. And the background that these guys were coming from was having built vulnerability scanners and had just had a different perspective. And they're like, well, what if we could go get the devices, stick them in our lab, instrument the functionality to do things like change passwords and upgrade the firmware and be able to do that for people? It's not enough to just have a vulnerability scanner to tell you there's a problem. Fixing it is the bigger challenge. So they went off and did that and kind of built this little, from a business perspective, I guess you could call it a moat. But they went with prospects, started going, hey guys, what kind of devices do you have? Oh, you've got this model camera, you've got this model of a door control. And they started going, and whether they could order it direct or go to eBay and get a used one, which has its own stories of the used stuff. They started to build up this tremendous library of devices with this kind of known functionality of, okay, these things work this way. And as we go into more and more customers, we get kind of this virtuous cycle where everybody gets these fixes as part of bringing bringing additional devices in. So they've kind of gone from, we want to find problems to fix them. And they do that. I think it's kind of closer to like, if I had to come up with an analogy, it's almost like a vulnerability scanner packaged with like a UiPath or something like that, where you can log into these tools. But what's unique about them is it's not just a web interface. They also talk all sorts of other obscure things like BACnet and Siemens protocols and Modbus, like stuff that there's not a web proxy for. So they kind of serve as this translation layer then for when you know how to change passwords and upgrade firmware and all that, you can then wire in your IT assets. So your PAM tools and stuff like that were always kind of meant to talk to the IT world. Now it talks all of those kind of IoT things. So it's kind of a different way to leverage stuff that was never really intended to talk and never intended to have kind of centralized management.
Great fit for the industrial sector. We've got a lot of legacy stuff out there that isn't used to talking to each other, so it seems like a great fit.
Yeah. I mean, they're doing some fascinating stuff, and I think we found a really interesting kind of problem set that we solve. But from like my perspective, the stuff I get to see with customers is just absolutely fascinating.
John, you've been talking about a lot of your past experiences. You've been a CISO for a number of different organizations. So going back a little bit to the people dynamic of cybersecurity, one of the ongoing challenges for manufacturers is just finding good workers for the plant floor. But then when we go into OT cybersecurity specifically, finding those folks is really, really hard, and it continues to be a challenge. What are some best practices or things that you've seen work in the past in terms of either growing those folks internally or going outside the organization to find them?
I mean, my personal preference is to grow folks, to invest in not just training, but the mentorship around the right way to actually do these things. I think there's for lack of a better term, kind of a gap in knowledge that develops with people. And a lot of times they kind of don't speak up and say, hey, I don't know how these things kind of link up. and really pulling on that string and getting them to that next kind of plateau. Because otherwise, I think people make uh, a lot of decisions without kind of critical thinking, where they understand what's going on. And I kind of equate it to um, kind of like monkeys slapping a typewriter. Um, a lot of times with software development, if they don't really understand it, they'll copy from a site, and they'll put in snippets, and they'll try stuff until it works, and not realize why it actually works or what they're trying to do. Like at some point, I think we need to back to basics for a lot of corporate America, to just reinstate the scientific method. To be like, all right, what are you actually trying to prove out? But I think there's a lot that can be done to mentor people internally. I don't know. I don't know that there is any one program that kind of solves that. I think it's very industry specific, where you're trying to figure out what is that impact, how does that affect the business, what stuff should you actually, choose to prioritize, and don't afraid to be technical. I think a lot of people, for as long as I can remember, or just like, oh, connections matter, we can figure it out. There's always going to be somebody that can do that thing. And then you realize that 15 years later, they didn't learn not just how to write software, but just the basics of being able to read it. And then they don't know how something works, and you start having these gaps that develop. So this is all to say, I don't think there's one way to do it, but my preference is often don't try to bring in a bunch of people from the outside. We need to be better managers. Our job is to manage those people's careers. So it's not specific to OT, but I think there's some stuff that we can all do to build a better workforce.
Well, absolutely, and there's never been more resources available, whether it's from folks that we've talked about CISA quite a bit here, a lot of other local security-based organizations, associations, professional associations, and suppliers. Sure. I mean, when you get into the big automation companies and other IT service providers, there's a lot of just organic material there that they're more than welcome, or more than ready to share with you. So John, 100%. John, this has been awesome. We've covered a lot of different stuff here. Kind of closing up, what do you see moving ahead? What are some of the big trends that you see having an impact in the next, we'll call it a year and a half?
So we're going to see more devices. The growth in the devices is a parabolic curve. We've kind of topped out on the number of desktop servers, that kind of stuff. So you will see more and more of these OT, IoT devices. I don't know that they're going to be the initial point of exploitation. So gaining a foothold is probably not going to be the sensational story most of the time. I say most of the time because there are still millions of these devices that are on the public internet. You go through Shodan or Census, choose your favorite way to search for targets. There's a lot of that stuff out there. I think people are getting better about making sure that the sensitive stuff is on the internal side. I think and don't quote me saying 12 to 18 months, but I think we will see some of these techniques wormify. I don't know if that's going to be combined with AI. I don't know if that's going to be only for a single class of device. I think with a fairly moderate amount of effort, you could see this across, dozens or hundreds of devices, just with default passwords and stuff like that. I think a lot of the industry has been focused on kind of traditional exploitation. And that's, hey, we're going to go, run an exploit, get a shell. Cool. What are you going to do with the shell now? A lot of that's been to pivot and do traditional ransomware. I think, as I was saying a bit earlier, when you figure out that these devices, that some of them, if you can get a whole class of them, are worth, hundreds of millions of dollars, that's going to change the dynamic of where the incentives are. And I think the attackers, if you wave enough treats in front of them, they're going to go after it. So the more of these devices, the more that they cost, the more that they're going to impact the business. I think that's going to be kind of the direction that starts to go. And I think this will be informed by intelligence agencies to a certain extent. And the reason I say that is, if you look at the recent prisoner swap with Russia, one of the people that got swapped back to the Russians was this guy that they labeled Putin's traitor, with a D, not an ITOR. um, so he essentially, these guys had set up an organization where they broke into like the managing agent for like half of the S&P 500, and these managing agents were taking in your quarterly filings and function as like a law firm that would file that with the regulatory agencies. So they had a one-stop shop for what your earnings are going to be, and they decided to do a bunch of insider trading with it. So that's well and good. Where I was saying the intelligence agencies get involved is there's a lot of speculation that these guys were kind of, they had the technical skills, they could do hacking. They would have never known that that managing agent was the place to go after, or that, this gold mine was there, unless someone had informed them of it. And I think that's going to be that kind of linchpin, that the technical sophistication to go after these devices at scale is there. The value of these devices is there. I think there's this gap in the middle of kind of matching those two things. Someone's going to say, okay, this is the target. This is what it's worth to that business. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, where you're going to have some state actors that are kind of putting pressure to one side of a scale, and it's going to start informing what the targets are going to be.
Yeah, no, that's scary. I mean, we've seen that on a somewhat of a different level with a lot of the supply chain hacks that we see in manufacturing. But if that starts worming into partner networks, that is terrifying.
I mean, if we have our like Melissa Worm moment for the OT IoT world, I think that's going to set up a new era of what we're going to be talking about, because it's going to look very different than it looks right now.
Thanks, John. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check him out at phosphorus.io. Thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For John Terrill, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.